Master, the tempest is raging, the billows are tossing high. The sky is overshadowed with blackness, no shelter or help is nigh. Canst thou not that we perish? How canst thou not?
All right, now I've made sure I have it up here so that I can get your comments, and Dale's monitoring that as well. Like he said, we are starting today in James chapter 2. Verse 14, our last 3 or 4 weeks, we've been covering the book of James and had a great discussion on favoritism and partiality and things like that last week. And talks quite a bit about those first 13 verses in James chapter 2. And today we're looking at the second half of that chapter, which has a discussion of faith and works and how those work together, Dale. And I know that that's a hot topic in the religious world. Dale's all the time with the alarms over here.
I'll forget. That was my snoozed reminder to start the camera. So. All right.
But I know that faith and works is a topic that there's a lot of discussion on. There's a lot of in the larger religious world. There's a lot of controversy about what these things mean and how they work together. And I think there's a lot of maybe a lot of opinion out there, and hopefully as we study today we can boil down past the opinion and get to the root of the truth here in what James has to say. First I'll start reading here at verse 14, and I'll be reading verse 14 through 17. It says, "What use is it, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but he has no works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, be warmed and be filled,' and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? Even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself." Let's go through this one verse at a time, maybe a couple verses there. The very first verse we read, verse 14, what does it profit? So we're looking for what is the benefit here? Why would it benefit us to have faith that doesn't show itself in our actions, is what he's saying here. If someone says he has faith but does not have works. So the works that he's talking about here are not, and I think this is where people get off track sometimes, the works that he talks about are not necessarily a checklist of things like the old law. Remember, he's talking to Jewish Christians mainly, is who he's talking to, that have been scattered around, and so they were used to the old law, and he's trying to teach them a new way of being, new religion, pure and undefiled religion. He had talked about in the previous chapter. He's teaching them a new way, and in the old law there were all these check boxes.
That's how you knew you were religious.
Right. You did all these things and these certain works and certain, sacrifices and feasts and this and that and all these different things that they would have thought of as works. But now we get to the New Testament. Jesus taught faith, and he also taught how we treat each other. And he immediately goes into an example of how we treat each other. So the faith that the people had in Christ and in this new covenant, New Testament, had to come with actions.
Right.
And so
it's still important.
Sometimes I feel like we want to put a checklist with it too. Well, we've got to do this and we've got to do that and we've got to do this. But I don't really feel like that's what James is talking about. I mean, there are things that are necessary for salvation that are taught in the New Testament that we talk about a lot. I know sometimes baptism comes into this. People think, well, baptism is a work, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But baptism is not necessarily a work. It's part of how we access salvation.
Yeah, it's an obedient act.
Exactly. And so here, when he's talking about works, I feel like he's not talking about based on the example that we are given in verse 15 and 16. the work itself is how we treat each other, how we treat those in need. And that goes back to the things he was talking about before in chapter 1 with pure and undefiled religion, and the things he's talking about how we treat people in the favoritism, partiality discussion.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that, Bill?
Well, I preached a few weeks ago about, about baptism, about what it is. And one of my major points was, you can't take a passage and say, well, that's it. And one passage I'm thinking of right here is Ephesians 2:8. For by grace you have been saved through faith, right? Which tells us, wow, grace saves you, faith saves you. Well, it's more than that. You've got to read beyond that one passage. Does grace save you? Yes. Does faith save you? Yes. Baptism saves you. Belief saves you. All of those things wrapped up together. But sometimes people will take passages and say, well, all you need is faith. Well, passages like this tell us, what faith is. Because I can say I have faith. I have faith in God. But James would contend with that, and he would say, well, Dale, you know what? You're saying it, but what are you really doing?
Exactly.
And this verse 14, I think, handles that.
Yeah. You can talk the talk, but do you walk the walk?
Right. Exactly.
To put it in our common little cliches there.
Right.
So, as you mentioned, we have grace, we have faith, and these things the Bible talks about saving us. And then some of these other ideas come under those headings.
Right.
Just in the last verse of the previous discussion we had, verse 13, talks about mercy and showing mercy to people. I think that falls under the concept of grace. Grace and mercy are similar, like that same kind of idea. Works, obedience, however you want to call that, falls under the heading of faith.
Right.
Faith, and we're going to get to that verse in a minute, has to have action underneath it. Mm-hmm. It can't be an empty faith. Faith is the jar, and the actions are what fills the jar. Right.
So actions are important. A lot of people try to downplay the works part.
Right.
But this passage says if you're going to have faith, you got to have works.
Well, and that's what our entire passage that we're going to study today keeps reinforcing.
Right.
The first example, as I read just a minute ago, verses 15 and 16, give us an example of that. If a brother or sister is without clothing, basically daily needs. What are your basic necessities of life? Somebody that you have a relationship with. It describes them as a brother or sister. Mm-hmm. But as we saw in the end of the previous chapter, widows and orphans, lots of different categories of people are mentioned as people we should be helping, we should be reaching out to, we should be caring for and providing for as we have means to do so. But he carries it a step further in verse 16. We want to help them in need, but we got to do it with action, not just with words, not just go in peace. A lot of times we can feel like we're good people because we have everybody's best interest at heart. Sometimes we refer to that as like agape love. I want everybody to, I love everyone, and it's that general, generic, have your best interest at heart kind of love. Mm-hmm. But I think James is taking it, he's taking it that step further. It's not only you have this sense of love, what does that mean? Right. What does that mean? Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments. There was the feeling, but then there was the action that came with that. Mm-hmm. And so it's this same interpersonal love that we have for others is characterized by action, not just by go in peace, be warmed and filled. I care about you. Yeah. But
and then you close the door.
Right, exactly.
That's how I always see this verse. I'm like, good luck with that. If somebody closes the door on it.
Exactly. So I think that's the point of these verses here. It's not only that you have faith, it's not only that you have good feelings about someone, but it's the actions that you follow that up with. As well. And then in verse 17 he caps it off saying, even so faith, if it has no works, if you have this belief, if you have this feeling, but you don't have action to back it up and action to support it, it's dead. It's empty. There's nothing there to support it.
Right. Faith, I've heard it said, is oftentimes belief in action.
Right.
Like you can believe and not do anything. But the faith is about the works at the same time.
It takes it to the next level of acting on that belief, or acting on that feeling.
Right.
Yeah. And one thing I think is interesting before we get out of this first little paragraph of this section, and different translations are going to translate this a different way. I know King James, New King James, some other translations, at the end of verse 14 says, "Can faith save him?" But I think it's interesting that New American Standard, as we've been using a couple of different versions here, inserts a word in there, and it says, "Can that faith save him?" I've got a little footnote here that also says it could be translated literally to, "Can the faith save him?" So it seems like it's referring back to the first part of this of the verse here. What does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? So if there's a faith without works, the question then is, can that kind of faith save him?
Right.
So can a faith without works that is dead, as we find out in verse 17, that is empty, can that kind of faith save a person? That's really what this entire segment from verse 14 down to the end of the chapter is really going to keep talking about. And like I said, there's 3 separate examples that that were given through this. The first one being the more general example here in verse 15 and 16 of helping a brother or sister in need. And then we go a little further down the bottom half of the bottom section of the chapter into Abraham and Rahab, which we'll get to those in just a second. But before we do that, Dale, there's one more little section here I want us to read and discuss briefly, verses 18 through 20. Can you read those 3 for me?
Sure. But someone may well say, "You have faith, and I have works. Show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one, you do well. The demons also believe and shudder. But are you willing to recognize, you foolish fellow, that faith without works is useless?"
The word uses the word
New American
useless
Standard,
now.
useless.
Right. Excuse me. So, and other translations are going to keep coming back and saying dead, but now we get a different kind of take on it. He keeps pounding this home. Faith without works. Say you have faith, I have works. Well, if you have, what does he mean by this faith that he's talking about in verse 18? You have faith and I have works. Well, I think the first, you have faith, he's referring to like an empty kind of faith, a dead
like
faith.
Talking about it.
Right, I'm talking about, have that belief, that feeling that we talked about, but not, it's never been acted on. And then we have someone else who maybe doesn't talk about or doesn't proclaim his faith, but shows in his actions. I can think of members here at Birdwell's Chapel that not the most extroverted people, not always out talking and don't preach, but you watch what they do, and their actions speak volumes, as we say. The things that they do, maybe behind the scenes, maybe just in the way they carry themselves, the way they guide. I'm thinking some of our older men, the way they guide their families, the way they the way they are role models for some of the rest of us. They show their faith by their works and by the things they do and by who they are in their character, more so than just through words or just through some type of vain, flowery persona.
Right. Yeah, you can look like you have a lot of faith, but let's see something.
Right. Actions speak louder than words is what we're coming down to here.
Right.
But yeah, so this person that can show their faith through their actions, through what they do and how they treat other people, given the example that we just had, that really is one example of a way to show, to show faith. And of course, he gives the example in verse 19 of, belief is not enough. The demons believe and shudder. They know. I mean, there was, the demon that was afraid when Jesus came to him, knew he would call him the Son of God, knew he was the Son of God, but and was fearful and shuddered. I think that's what this this verse may be referring to, is that story back in the Gospels. But it just proves to us that belief by itself is not enough.
Right.
It does take, it takes more than that. We show that faith through our works.
We'll oftentimes say you've got to be a faithful Christian. And what we mean by that is you're doing things. Now, some people might say, well, you can't work your way to heaven. No, you can't. You know, that's where grace comes in. I can't do enough of these good works to warrant my place in heaven. But because of the redeeming blood of Christ, hey, you know, he saves me. He does the saving.
Right.
But as a faithful Christian servant of God, you know, I'm doing those things, you know, to show my faith.
Right. And faith has to be based in love. And like I mentioned earlier, Jesus says, if you love me, keep my commandments. Love is also another one of those action things. Mm-hmm. You know, faith is based in action. Love is based in action. So many of the things that we see in the Bible, in the New Testament, are action based. Mm-hmm. It's about how we engage in the world. What do we do? How do we engage with people? How do we teach? How do we love? How do we help? How do we minister to people? It's not only sitting in a room and saying, well, I've got faith. Mm-hmm. You know, I read through the whole Bible and I didn't do anything about it. You know, yeah. You can have knowledge without wisdom, like we talked about a couple of weeks ago. You got to have that next step. You got to take it further.
Well, here in the chat room here on the video, Brother Mike Bumbelow makes a good comment. He says, authenticate, right?
I like that word.
Good word. Yeah. Authenticate faith with good works. Excellent point. Way to wrap a lot of that up.
Yeah, very good. I just had to do a authentication on my Facebook account.
Yes. I see that you just joined us. Glad you're joining us.
Yeah, well, there you go. All right. So let's look at our couple of examples that we have here of faith that James tells us about. Now, before we get to that, a lot of times when we think of a Bible chapter that would be descriptive of faith, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of, I want to see some examples of faith?
Hebrews 11.
Hebrews 11, right? The Hall of Fame of Faith. We talk about that chapter a lot. This is sort of a mini version of that. In fact, both of these people that are mentioned in this are mentioned in that verse or in that chapter as well. And James just takes those examples and kind of boils it down. So the first one that's mentioned here is Abraham. Beginning in verse 21 says, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac his son on the altar? You see that faith was working with his works, and as a result of his works, faith was perfected. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, and Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. Verse 24, you see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. Now, a lot of people have that faith only or faith alone comment. This is the only verse in the Bible that talks about that. And what does it say right before it? Not by faith only, not by faith alone. It's got to be coupled with action. Sure. Now, as we know, this story about Abraham and Isaac comes from Genesis chapter 22, where, you know, Abraham and his wife Sarah had lived a long life and had not had any children, and he asked God for children, and finally at the age of 100 they finally were given their son Isaac from God. And then what did God ask Isaac to do? Take him up on a mountain and you're going to offer him as a sacrifice. The son you've been waiting so long for, and is such a blessing, and now you got to take him and sacrifice him. And as a father, we're both fathers here. That, to me, that story always I can't imagine being asked to do something like that.
Right.
You know, now, some days, my boys are both teenagers. Some days, you know, okay, maybe no. Even on their worst days.
Wyatt, Jonah.
Even on their worst days, I wouldn't want to go take them on a mountain and sacrifice them. But Abraham, as a result of his faith, you know, he had already been faithful to God in so many things before that that we won't get into today. But, you know, he had been showing his faith in God throughout his entire life. And this sort of was the pinnacle of all these things that he had done, the climax of that whole lifetime of faithful action. And as it says here. Abraham believed God, followed it up with action. He went and took his son up there, but the angel stopped him.
Yeah.
And so, Abraham's faith, he proved himself to God. Mm-hmm. Now, do we have faithful action? Is that our goal? Are we trying to prove ourselves to God? God's omniscient. He knows what our thoughts are. He knows what our actions are going to be. I don't feel like we're necessarily proving ourselves to Him through our works. That's not what these faithful actions that we're talking about are for. It's not for us to gain something. We're not trying to buy His favor with our actions here. It's us fulfilling that faith.
Yeah, that's
have.
how you show your faith. If you're not doing these works that we're talking about here, how much faith do you really have? Because I think this faith of Abraham goes back. Brother Barry Jarvis brings up this point, Genesis 12, 1 through 4, where God promises to Abraham, I will, in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So a lot of people reference this passage, that while Abraham was going to sacrifice his son, he knew that God would still bless him somehow,
right.
Whether by another son. I'm just wondering what sort of imagination Abraham had.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to kill this son, but how's God then going to fulfill this promise? So he had faith in the promises of God.
Right, and our faith is based on promises God has given us too. We live a faithful life if we do the things He tells us to do. Jesus said, "Keep my commandments." We do those things. We're promised a home in heaven one day. The Old Testament was facing toward the New Testament. The New Testament is facing toward heaven. And so, we have faith, and we fulfill that faith through our actions so that we can also partake of that promise in heaven that we've been given as well.
Right.
Okay, well, let's look at the last example here that we have in this verse. And this comes from Joshua chapter 2, the story of Rahab. You want to go ahead and read those last 3 verses, 24 to the end of the chapter there?
Sure. You see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. In the same way, was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead.
So the story of Rahab, like I mentioned from Joshua chapter 2, this was when the spies were coming into the land of Canaan to search out the land. Rahab lived in Jericho, and we know Jericho from the big walls, and she lived near that. And so she was hiding a couple of the spies. The authorities in Jericho were looking for them, and there were 2 men that were hiding out at Rahab's place. And so she hid them and then allowed them to escape getting caught. And so those spies were able to come back and tell Joshua and the Israelite army about what was going on in Jericho. And of course then, with God's help, they defeated that city. But if not for Rahab's faith, she could have easily just turned those guys right over to the authorities there and let them get caught. But sometimes I wonder where Rahab's faith came from. They were in the city of Jericho. God was with the Israelite army and with the Israelite people. Rahab was a citizen of Jericho. And a harlot at that. And so where did Rahab's faith come from? We're not told that. We don't know that. But we're just told that Rahab had faith. Well, how do we know? Rahab was a harlot. Rahab lived in Jericho of Canaan. Rahab did this. How do we know Rahab had faith? Well, if you look at those things, you wouldn't think.
No.
Rahab doesn't have any faith. She was engaged in some sin. Okay, she was a harlot. She was the enemy. She was a citizen of Jericho of Canaan. So initially, just by looking at this person or by thinking about what her situation was, you wouldn't think, well, that's a person of faith. We just studied in the first half of the thing about this chapter about favoritism. When you see somebody forming an opinion about them before you really know. Rahab, through her actions of helping these men of God that were there to spy on the city, showed her faith. So her faith wasn't based on her persona, it wasn't based on her reputation, it was based on action.
Right.
So faith goes past all those things into what it all boils down to what our actions are. And then once again, in verse 26, he keeps coming back to that same point of, for just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. And so he's mentioned that idea of faith without works being dead over and over and over throughout this, really trying to take that point home.
Right.
And I think he does. I mean, these examples that we're given here, whether it's the empty platitudes at the beginning of this section with the go in peace part, or whether it's talking about the demon's empty belief, but not followed up by actions, whether it's talking about the example of Rahab, the example of Abraham, all these things, he keeps coming back. Faith has to be accompanied by action.
Yeah.
So
we've got some great examples here that I think lead us to that conclusion, that faith is important, but you got to have works along with it. You can't just say you have it,
Yeah.
I think